Today we're going to show you how to replace the motor on your dryer, and it's a really easy job. All we're going to need is a 1/4 inch nut driver, a 5/16 nut driver, a long flat blade screwdriver, and a Phillips screwdriver, maybe a pair of needle nose pliers, a 7/16 open end wrench, and a 1/2 inch drive ratchet with an extension. Let me show you how we do it. Now, to do this repair, since we will be working near some electrical circuits, we'll have to disconnect the power to the dryer, so simply pull it forward and unplug the dryer. And if it's a hardwired dryer, we'll need to locate the fuse panel or breaker panel and turn the power off at that point. We'll next want to pull the dryer far enough forward that we can gain access to the back of it, so you'll need to disconnect it from the vent. Now, on conventional dryers that have a console on the back, you will need to remove the end caps and the screws that secure the console to the top and tilt it back to remove the top. On this style of dryer, we simply will need to remove 2 screws at the back of the main top and pull it back to gain access. There are 2 1/4 inch hex head screws that secure the top on this model. Just remove those, slide the top panel back, and then lift it free. Now, in this model, we'll need to remove the control panel from the front, and it has a couple of plastic clips inside that you'll be able to see that will need to be disengaged. So simply push them sideways to disengage them and tilt the console forward. And you may need the long blade screwdriver to access those tabs. Then there'll be 3 tabs across the top that we'll need to lift up on the console to disengage those. And we can tilt it forward and lift it up and out of the way. Now, that will give us access to 2 1/4 inch hex head screws that secure the front panel in place. And we'll also need to remove 2 screws in each bottom corner that secure the lower access panel. So we'll remove those first, and then just pull away on the bottom edge of that access panel and tilt it forward and let it drop down to unhook it from the bottom of the front panel. And we can set that aside. Now, next, there are 2 1/4 inch hex head screws in the bottom of that front panel. We can remove those. Now, before we remove the front panel, we'll want to disconnect the harness that goes to the door switch. So locate that below the front panel and just slide a flat blade screwdriver in under that locking tab to separate that. There are tabs on both sides of that connector. And unplug the harness. Now, on these round door models, there are also 2 Phillips screws on either side of the lint screen opening that will need to be removed. And then the last step is to remove the 2 1/4 inch hex head screws at the top of that front panel. And just keep some weight against that panel to hold it against the cabinet as you remove those screws. And then lift up on the whole assembly, tilt it forward, and remove it. Now, our next step will be to remove the front bulkhead. And on models that have an electronic sensor dry, you'll need to disconnect the wire harness to that. So again, with a flat blade screwdriver, just go in under those locking tabs on the connector and just spread them enough that will allow it to disconnect. And then we'll remove the 2 1/4 inch hex head screws on the bottom. And we're also going to remove 2 screws on that blower housing, located here and here. Now, these screws are typically a gold color screw to indicate which ones that need to be removed. And then lastly, we can just loosen these 2 top screws. You'll note that there is a keyhole slot that fits down over those screws, so we don't need to completely remove them. And that will support that front bulkhead until we remove it. So just carefully pull on the bottom of that blower housing, lift up gently to clear the bottom lip of the cabinet. Once we've cleared that, we can lift up on the bulkhead, disengage it from those keyhole slots, and then tuck it down from behind the top panel. We can now set that aside. Now, next, we'll want to remove the control panel completely from the dryer. So you'll note that there is a harness on this model. It comes from the control panel back to the control board on the side here. So we just take our flat blade screwdriver and just release that locking tab with just enough pressure to clear the harness connector. pull that through and then set this aside. Now we will need to remove the drum as well. So we're going to remove this bracket from the front to allow us enough room to lift that up and pull the drum forward. We'll also need to disconnect the belt from the drum. So reaching in over top of the blower outlet, and reach back until we find that belt, and you'll feel where it goes around an idler pulley. So we'll need to pull that idler pulley enough to release the tension. So pull it towards the left, roll the belt off of the idler, and that will give enough slack in that belt that we'll be able to lift the drum up and away. So remove screws that secure that support from the cabinet. On this model there'll be one on the top and the side, and you may have enough flexibility by just removing one side, but I find that you need to at least loosen the one on the front on the opposite side, and that should give you enough flexibility to pull that drum out from underneath of it. Slide the belt back off of the drum as you pull it forward. And then set that aside. Now with the drum out, we can replace the screws on that top support to hold the cabinet rigid. We have better access now to the motor, and we'll first of all need to remove the blower wheel from the front of the motor. Once we pull that off, then we'll be able to remove the blower housing. Now the blower wheel is threaded onto that motor shaft, and it's a left-handed thread. So we'll slide that 7/16 wrench down over that shaft, and then just rotate that until it catches on the wrench, and then let that wrench lay up against the screw on the housing. And then turn the ratchet clockwise. That will allow the blower wheel to unthread from the motor shaft. And set it aside. You'll now have access to screws that secure that blower housing to the motor frame. So we're using the 1/4" nut driver. We'll remove those 3 screws. And next we'll remove one more 1/4" screw that secures the outlet duct to the blower housing. And then we can pull that free, lift it off the motor shaft, and turn it out of the way. Now next we're going to remove the harness connector to the motor. Just slide a flat blade under that clip, lift that up enough to release it, and the same thing on the bottom. Remove the 2 wires that go to the belt switch. And you can either remove these 2 clamps with the motor mount in place, or you can remove the 2 screws and remove the motor and the motor mount as an assembly. There's the 2 slotted openings, 2 tabs on the motor bracket will fit into. So we'll carefully lift the motor out, and we'll set that on a suitable work surface where we can exchange it. Now with the motor removed from the dryer and set on a suitable work surface, we can go ahead and exchange that onto the old bracket. And if you haven't removed the wires at this point, we'll need to disconnect the 2 blue wires that go to that belt switch. One will just plug into the overload device on the motor, and the other will fit into the harness connector. So use the pliers and pull that one off. Now the motor is held to that bracket with 2 spring clips on either end of the motor, and there'll be a little hook on those that if you take a large flat blade screwdriver, you can just push down on and disengage that hook from a tab on the motor bracket. And if they're really tight on there, you can give that screwdriver a tap with a hammer and that'll break it free. Normally you should be able to just pry them loose. Just push down, pry outward, and then lift the spring brackets off. Now at this point you should be able to just lift that motor off of the motor bracket and discard it. We'll take our new motor and make sure that we set that in the same position. Then reinstall the clips. And to reinstall those clips, we're going to hook one side over the tab. And then again, using the flat blade screwdriver, we should be able to just pop that down on there. Make sure that you protect yourself so that it doesn't spring off. And make sure those spring clips fit completely over the rubber mounting bushing. And check to make sure they're fully engaged on those tabs. Then we can reconnect the belt switch wires. And if they appear a bit loose, just take the needle nose pliers and just give those a little bit of a crimp. Retighten them. Now if the motor on your dryer does not have a quick connect plug, you'll need to follow the instructions that come with the kit to make sure that we have it attached properly. We're now ready to put the motor and motor bracket back in the dryer. So we're just going to carefully lift that motor into position, and then we'll engage those two tabs in the slotted openings in the bottom. And then push it far enough to the left to line up the two screw holes. Then we'll replace those two 5/16 hex head screws. And we need to make sure that we tighten those screws securely. Next, we'll rotate the blower housing into position. Make sure we line up the outlet duct. And then we'll install the screw that holds that outlet duct to the blower housing. And then the three screws that secure the blower housing to the motor bracket. And once we have all three screws installed, we'll make sure that we tighten them securely. And next we'll reinstall the blower wheel. We'll just carefully thread that onto the shaft of the motor until it begins to tighten up. Then we'll take our 7/16 wrench, we'll slide it down between the motor bracket and the blower housing, and then lean it up against either the base of the dryer or one of these screws that goes through the blower housing. And then we'll tighten it with the ratchet. And then remove that extension from the blower wheel and the 7/16 wrench. Now next we'll reinstall the harness connector to the motor. So line it up. Push it on firmly until both the top and bottom locking tabs are engaged. And we're now ready to reassemble the dryer. We're now ready to reinstall the drum into the dryer. Now when reinstalling the belt, we need to know how it will fit around the idler and the motor pulley. It will basically look like this. And that will allow the groove side of that belt to lay up against the drum and provide spring tension to keep it tight. Now when installing it, we're just going to drape it over the drum, lift the drum into position, and then we'll install the belt onto the idler pulley and motor pulley once we have it in place. And now we can reassemble the dryer. Now when reassembling, Well, first of all, take the screw out that holds that cross member in place. That will allow us to lift that up enough to fit the drum in place. And just leave it a little bit forward so that we can drape the belt around the drum, feeding it through from the back side. Now we can push it back the rest of the way, and we'll want to make sure that those rollers fit up into the groove inside the drum. And make sure that the felt fits nicely around that back bulkhead. Now at this point we're going to reinstall the belt around the motor and idler pulleys. Now to install that belt, we're going to reach one hand in from the right hand side over top of the outlet duct assembly, and the other hand we can reach in from the left side of the cabinet. And then we're going to take that belt, lay it across the top of the idler pulley with the groove side up, and then from the right side we're going to push it in underneath that idler pulley, forming the loop. And as we push the idler pulley to the left, we can take that loop and wrap it around the motor pulley. And just feel that belt, make sure that it's right side against the drum. And then carefully rotate the drum clockwise for a few turns, and you should see the blower wheel turning like that. You should see the groove side of the belt against the drum, and it should center up just about an inch forward into that hollow spot on the drum. Now we can reinstall the screw that holds that cross member in place, as well as the screw on the top that we removed. Now next we'll put the front bulkhead in place. Now when installing the front bulkhead on the round door style of dryer, we need to make sure that we get the bottom portion of that blower housing cover in over the lip of that cabinet. Now there is a bit of a cutout there, so we're going to tuck the top of it in first, in behind that cross member. And we're going to lift it up high enough that we can clear that opening, and then lift up on the drum to make sure it sits down on top of the rollers. And then you can rotate it into position. Make sure the keyhole slots line up with those screws. And then we can go ahead and install the two bottom screws and tighten the two top ones. And replace the two screws that secure that cover to the blower housing. And if your model has sensors in the drum, we'll need to reconnect that wire harness. Make sure it's inserted enough that the locking tabs on both sides engage. And if you removed the screw on the left side of that cross member, remember to reinstall that. Now when reinstalling the front panel, we'll want to make sure that we have a couple of screws handy here. And then we're just going to lay it in position. We'll line up the screw holes at the top, hold it in position. And once we have the two top screws there to support it, we can make sure it's lined up, fits flush with the cabinet. And then install the two bottom screws, and then tighten all four of those securely. Remember to reconnect the door switch harness and insert the plug in full enough that the locking tabs engage. We can next reinstall the control panel. Begin by inserting the harness through that opening, and then we're going to engage this large tab in the center with the rectangular opening on that cross member, and then also engage the two tabs on either side and the three across the top. Make sure those tabs spring back towards the center of the console so that they're locked in position. Also reconnect the cable connector to the control board on the left side at the top here, and insert it fully so that the little locking tab hooks on the bottom and holds it in place. Then open the door and replace those 2 Phillips screws that secure the front panel to the bulkhead. We'll reinstall the bottom panel. We'll make sure that this top lip in the panel tucks up in underneath the front panel, and hold that in position while you install the 1/4-inch screws. And if need be, you may have to tilt that dryer back enough to get good access to those 2 screws in the bottom of the front panel. Tighten them securely. And now we can put the main top back on. Now when reinstalling the main top on these round door models, you note there are a couple of tabs, and they will fit into that slot just where the cabinet is recessed back a little bit behind the cross member. So lay it into position, make sure it's down nice and flush, push it forward, and ensure that it engages those tabs. And then install the 2 1/4-inch screws that hold it in position. We're now ready to reconnect the vent, and our repair is complete.